This morning's text, really all three, the psalm is always about prayer, but this morning's text, the Old Testament, the epistle, and the gospel, are all about having a deep, personal prayer life, intimate with our Father in heaven. And if you'd heard that as the likely topic of this morning, you might think, okay, it's going to be a pretty straightforward Sunday on prayer, until you read that Old Testament story. That Old Testament story, you can be forgiven for thinking, it's a bit weird, right? You can listen to it, you're like, okay. For starters, it sounds like two cranky people haggling in a market somewhere. If your spouse or your parent and you were out with them and they started trying to purchase something in this way, you would, if you're like me, look aside and then kind of walk away, hoping no one noticed you're with the people who are arguing about the price of melons. But of course, it's not the price of melons. It's Father Abraham, and it's God. Again, this story is about having a deep and personal relationship with our Father in heaven. And this is a bit of a weird start as well, but there's a kind of price of entry for this story for modern readers. There's a part that would have, a couple hundred years ago, just kind of flown on by, but I think we have to kind of pay the piper before we can get in. And that's this whole idea that God is about to judge a whole city. That God is mad at Sodom and Gomorrah and he's coming for them. That he is a God of judgment. A lot of us are not comfortable with the idea of a God of judgment these days. And there's understandable reasons for that. But that's a whole other sermon for a whole other day. But here's what you need to know to be able to get into this story. A God who is not a God of judgment is not a God you want to have anything to do with. A God who is not a God of judgment is a God who is okay with the world today, right now, as it is. A God who is not a God of judgment is a God who looks at evil square in the face and says, yeah, I'm good with it. It doesn't bother me so much. To be sure, we need God to be a God of mercy. We need that judgment to be cloaked and brought with mercy. But we definitely want a God who's a God of judgment. God who's not a God of judgment is like the parent who never disciplines their child, who has no hope for them to grow. Now, for those of you who think, gosh, I'm still not sold on this, just go with me and hang with me that you want a God of judgment. Put a pin in it, have another conversation later. For those of you that wish this whole sermon was about God's judgment and Sodom and Gomorrah, I also would ask you to put a pin in that, and let's move forward and see what happens with Abraham. The reason that's important to move forward is because Abraham discovers this morning something fundamental about who God is and how he's going to relate to his creation. There's an earth-shattering bit of news that comes right out of this story this morning as Abraham begins to pray. The first clue of what's going on, though, in this sermon comes before Abraham speaks. And it comes in this weird little phrase that you might catch where it says, God heard of what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he decided he was going to come down and see about it. Now, you can be forgiven if you're kind of a certain kind of literal kind of mind of saying, God has to come down and check out what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. I thought God already knew. Here's the thing. The author assumes you know God already knows. God is fully aware of what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. So why does the text say, well, he comes down? That is an unbelievably bit of good news and clues us into what the whole passage is about. This passage is about that deep relationship with God and the fact that God would bother to come down and see his creation. That God would say, oh, I know what's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's all the things you've heard about. They're horrible to each other. They're worse to poor people. They've been persecuting God's own people. We'll get back to that. But God doesn't need to come down. God comes down because he wants that relationship. And there's Abraham. And Abraham starts asking God questions about how God works in the world. Prayer is about that kind of relationship that you might have with the person who matters most to you in the world. You don't need to tell that person, I love you, for them to know. They know. You don't need to go spend time with someone for them to know you care about them. They know. But you do it anyway because it's true, because relationships are made up of doing things like that. And when you keep doing it over and over and over again, you begin to learn some new things about one another. Abraham does something remarkable in this prayer. He starts praying. Again, this is a city that has been a problem for Abraham. There are some of his kin in there, but the normal prayer would be like, hey, I've got a couple people in there, and if you could get them out, God, that'd be great, and then have at it. Go for it. They've been after me. Take them down. That's not what Abraham does. Abraham, and a great demonstration of what Jesus is going to command us to do, prays for his enemies, prays for sinners, prays for the unrighteous, prays for those who are coming after him. And then he learns this thing. He says, God, I know, bad. They've been bad for me, bad for you, get it. What if there are some righteous people in there? Just a few. What if there are 50? What about 45? What if there are 10? And we find out that the way God's mercy and judgment work together is the righteousness of a few can cover the unrighteousness of many. Totally new idea in human history, that the righteousness of just a few people can make up for the unrighteousness of many. Abraham's sitting here having this conversation with God and finds out that truth about God's mercy. But you don't have to be a wild, systematic theologian to see what's going on here. Jesus is the righteous one, the only truly righteous one, who makes up for the unrighteousness of the entirety of God's creation. What we see happening in this negotiation between Abraham and our Father in heaven is a demonstration of what is going to happen with Jesus on the cross. The very weird thing about this story is not that God is going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. The astounding, bizarre thing about this story is that God is willing to withhold the right judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, not because there were a lot of people, not because there were most people, but because there were just a few righteous people. That's the mercy we see wrapping God's judgment, even 10. And we come to find out later, thousands of years later, that God will withhold his judgment because of even 1. So what do we want to do with that? It's a nice truth, perhaps. What do we want to do? In order to answer that question, we have to place ourselves in this story. And a lot of times we want to say, well, we want to be like Abraham. He prays for his enemies. He talks to God. He's in this loving relationship. And that's great. Go, be like Abraham. But you and I, we are not Abraham in this story. You and I are also, I think I don't have to tell you, not the 10 righteous. So that leaves, we're also not God. So that leaves only one other set of players. We are the great unrighteous in Sodom and Gomorrah who need a righteous man to stand in for us. If we cannot find ourselves amongst the unrighteous in this story, then there really isn't another thing we can go with as far as applying it to our lives. The first step is to realize that we are the unrighteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, needing the righteous to come and cover us. But if we made that leap, then there is a next step. We can begin to live into Abraham's example and try to offer our meager bits of righteousness, our little bitty bits of righteousness, and more importantly, our prayers following Abraham's example for the rest of the world. We can try and follow Abraham, and we can try and follow. Abraham is acting as this priest this morning. We can try and follow him and this great high priest we have in Jesus, and continually pleading with the Father in that deep relationship that we hear about in the gospel lesson. Again, another sermon for another day. But we can keep offering those prayers for our enemies, for those who are hurting, for those who would hurt us, so that we can find ourselves in that ever deeper relationship.